Relics of Terror. Have you ever wondered what truly happens when life bids farewell to existence? This curiosity over the years has led me to a place where few dare to venture. A cemetery shrouded in mysteries and dark secrets. I am Miguel, the gravedigger of Silent Hill, a name that resonates with the melancholy and pain of a past that will never fade. Here, among weathered tombstones and semi-abandoned graves, I have spent the last 25 years of my life, delving into the darkness that permeates this place. Valle dos Rios, a small town forgotten by time, houses this cemetery that at first glance may seem merely a resting place. But when the fog rises and night falls, something transforms. The shadows grow denser, and the atmosphere becomes oppressive, as if the dead themselves guard secrets they do not wish to share. The old mausoleum at the center, with its rusty doors and hidden symbols carved into the stone, is the true guardian of these secrets. I know every corner of this cemetery, every name etched on the tombstones, every story lost to time. However, there is something more that I carry, a burden that has become part of me. Rumors about my past as a former soldier have always hovered over me like a shadow. During a patrol, I lost my comrades under circumstances I could never explain. Since then, nightmares have haunted me, blending familiar faces with the graves I dig daily. Guilt is a weight I cannot discard. Here in the cemetery, I found refuge, but also a prison. During the darkest days, when the damp earth exhales its scent and the wind whistles through the dry trees, I feel that the past will never let me find peace. It was on one of those afternoons while I was digging a new grave that I met Lara, a young anthropology intern. Her curiosity and determination were palpable, and I immediately sensed she was not just another visitor. Lara was there to catalog ancient bones, studying funerary rituals from the 19th century. I admired her passion, but I also worried about what she might uncover. Her grandmother, a superstitious woman, had always warned her to keep her distance from sacred places. Lara, however, ignored those warnings, and in doing so began to see shadows and hear voices whispering her name. "Have you ever felt that something is watching you?" I once asked her, as the fog enveloped the cemetery. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, and it was in that conversation that I saw the spark of mutual understanding. When the storm approached, Lara convinced me to open the doors of the mausoleum. "I need to know what's inside," she said, her voice laden with a determination I knew all too well. This decision would be the turning point of our lives. As the doors opened, a chilling cold ran down our spines. The interior of the mausoleum was more than I could have imagined. A dark chamber crowded with mysteries, where echoes of laughter and whispers seemed to dance among the walls. Little did we know that by breaking the silence of that place, we were unleashing something that had been trapped for centuries. What began as mere curiosity quickly transformed into a fight for survival. Roberto, the new cemetery administrator, entered the scene with ambitious plans to modernize the site. He ignored my warnings and dismissed the tales of it being a cursed place. To him, it all boiled down to money and efficiency. The idea of destroying the mausoleum to build a modern memorial left me anguished. And though Lara and I tried to convince him of the danger, Roberto was more interested in his own ghosts. But there was something deeper in his story. His mother had disappeared under mysterious circumstances near the cemetery when he was a child. His desire to uncover the truth only fueled the darkness that was beginning to spread. As events escalated, Father Alvaro, the skeptical priest who tended to the adjacent chapel, found himself drawn into our struggle. He who had lost his faith hesitated to help us, but the growing sense of evil about to be unleashed forced him to confront his own fears. "We cannot ignore what lies before us," he said, his voice trembling, as he realized that the ancient exorcism that had failed in the past had opened a door that should not be touched. Nights turned into nightmares. The cemetery, once my refuge, now pulsed with a dark energy. Voices echoed between the trees, and the sounds of children's laughter mingled with screams of terror. Lara, Roberto, and I were pawns in a game we did not understand. What were once secrets kept among the tombstones had now become palpable threats, and the town of Valle dos Rios was about to face the consequences of our curious awakening. The battle between what was buried and what we wanted to forget intensified. With every grave I dug, I felt my own memories being unearthed. The weight of guilt, the echo of forgotten laughter, all intertwined in a tangle of horror. The question that haunted me incessantly was, can you endure? And as I faced the reality of our mistake, I realized that the true struggle was not just against what lurked in the shadows, but also against the demons each of us carried within. Now, as the fog rises and the cemetery's secrets unfold before us, I perceive that the answer to my own question may be more terrifying than any entity we might encounter. The cemetery of Silent Hill is not just a resting place. It is a mirror reflecting our failings, our fears, and above all, the thin line between life and death. What lurks is not just a secret, but the truth that we all fear to confront. Lara and I, united by curiosity and determination, began to explore the mausoleum more deeply. The atmosphere around us felt charged with electricity, and each step we took echoed like a warning against the stone walls. As we examined the ancient artifacts and the carved symbols, the feeling that we were being watched grew increasingly intense. We talked about what we might find, but deep down, we both knew there was something deeper at play. That night, the voices began to manifest more clearly. I was lying in my bed, trying to fend off the nightmares that haunted me, when I heard a familiar whisper. It was as if someone were calling my name, a distant and chilling melody that resonated in my mind. I got up, filled with curiosity and fear, and followed the sound to the cemetery. The fog had gathered, turning everything around me into an indistinct mass of shadows and silences. When I arrived at the mausoleum, the door was ajar, as if something or someone were inviting me in. The cold emanating from within made me hesitate, but the memory of Lara and her determination gave me courage. As I crossed the threshold, a wave of pulsating energy enveloped me, and the darkness seemed to come alive around me. It was then that I realized I was not alone. Nebulous forms writhed in the shadows, and I could hear childlike laughter echoing off the walls. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. Terror consumed me, and I ran outside, stumbling over my own legs. Looking back, I saw a figure materialize. A child with empty eyes and a smile that seemed more like a mask of pain than of joy. What I had thought was merely a whisper had become a palpable presence, an entity that fed off fear. The next day, I found Lara in the cemetery, still excited about the prospect of investigation. I couldn't hide the panic in my gaze, and as I shared my experience, I realized she wasn't fully aware of what we were truly facing. She listened intently, but her determination only seemed to intensify. Together, we decided that we needed to speak with Father Alvaro. The priest, who had become an almost mystical figure to me, dealt with the supernatural in a skeptical yet profoundly respectful manner. When we arrived at the chapel, he was engaged in his usual routine of prayer, but upon noticing our presence, he interrupted everything and invited us in. As we recounted our story, his eyes narrowed and he became more serious. He said, "You have opened a door that should not have been opened," his voice heavy with concern. "But what can we do?" I asked, urgency growing in my voice. "We need to understand what is happening." The priest hesitated, looking at the altar as if seeking the answer in the shadows. He told me about an ancient ritual that had failed decades ago, intended to seal an entity responsible for the disappearance of several children from the town. According to him, that entity had been trapped within those walls, but by opening the mausoleum, freedom had been granted. "What now lurks may have an insatiable appetite," he warned. As we talked, Roberto rushed in, interrupting our discussion with contagious excitement. He had found old documents suggesting the existence of a cult operating in the town, a group that believed the souls of the missing children could be invoked for power. "We need to understand what happened," he insisted, disregarding the warnings he had received. His quest for truth was becoming an obsession, which worried me. However, the intensity of events began to escalate. Less than a week later, Lara disappeared. The last time I saw her, she was determined to investigate an ancient tomb that had caught her attention. I went to find her, but found only the oppressive silence of the cemetery. Despair consumed me as I searched for her, calling her name in vain. The bond between us, which had once seemed unbreakable, was now a tenuous thread about to snap. I couldn't just stand still. The priest and Roberto became my allies in the search, but I knew that with every step we took, the shadow surrounding us grew denser. The whispers that had once been faint now turned into screams, echoing in my mind as if they wanted to pull me into the darkness. I began to realize that the true battle was not only against what lurked in the cemetery, but also against the very ghosts each of us carried. The cemetery, once my refuge, had now become a battleground. The fight for Lara's life and the truth behind the disappearances was becoming increasingly personal. I knew we needed to act quickly before more lives were consumed by this entity that had been unleashed. Time was running out, and I felt we were all about to face a revelation that could change everything. What we would discover next would not just be a matter of survival, but a struggle for the very soul of Valle dos Rios. The despair over Lara's absence consumed me like a fire that burned without extinguishing. With each passing day, the feeling that we were being followed by a growing shadow became unbearable. Father Alvaro, with his worried expression, tried to comfort me, but his words sounded empty as I relived the last time I saw Lara. Her determination and the gleam in her eyes as she spoke about the grave that fascinated her. Now all I felt was the helplessness of not knowing where she was. Roberto, on the other hand, delved into his old documents, searching for any clue that could lead us to answers. He was so obsessed with the search for the truth that he seemed to ignore the urgency of the situation. I felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. And each time Roberto mentioned the cult and the disappearances, the pressure within me increased. The voices that were once whispers now became deafening screams, as if they wanted to alert me to something I couldn't comprehend. One night, as I tried to sleep, I was struck by a vision. An image of Lara surrounded by shadows, her face distorted in an expression of terror. I saw her screaming, but the sound did not reach me. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, feeling like I was losing control of the situation. What troubled me most was the sensation that the entity was feeding off my despair, growing stronger as I sank deeper into my own pain. I decided I could no longer wait. With a renewed sense of urgency, I went to the mausoleum, determined to confront the darkness that was pursuing us. The path there seemed longer and more twisted than before, as if the very earth was opposing me. A thick fog enveloped the cemetery, and the darkness seemed to move, pulsing like an evil heart. Arriving at the mausoleum door, I hesitated. The intense cold wrapped around me again, and I almost stepped back, but the thought of Lara pushed me forward. As I entered, the atmosphere was heavier than before. The voices were louder, more insistent, and I could feel that something was about to happen. The shadows twisted around me, and suddenly a nebulous form appeared before me, the child with empty eyes I had seen before. This time, however, there was something different. She seemed clearer, more present, as if trying to communicate. "Help us!" The child's voice sounded like a lament echoing against the walls. The cold around me intensified, and a deep sadness enveloped me. "We need help to be free." Reality began to unravel before my eyes. The walls of the mausoleum seemed to distort, and I was being pulled into a place where time and space made no sense. I saw flashes of children playing, laughing, and then suddenly, the laughter turned into screams. A terrifying vision unfolded. The missing children, surrounded by shadows, their souls trapped in a cycle of despair. I was paralyzed, the reality I knew crumbling. A wave of pain and despair hit me like a tsunami. The entity was there, and I felt its presence, an oppressive force feeding off fear. I didn't know if it was real or an illusion created by the entity itself, but the terror was palpable. At the moment the darkness seemed about to consume everything, an image of Lara appeared in my mind. Her determination, her courage. I cannot let this happen, I thought, and with a colossal effort I managed to move. I fought against the darkness, trying to focus on hope and light. The child's voice echoed in my head, and I knew I had to help her. With a shout, I concentrated all my energy on the phrase Father Alvaro had told me. "You cannot have power over us." The voices in the cemetery began to quiet, and the child's form started to dissolve. The mausoleum filled with an intense light, and the darkness began to recede, as if being repelled. I collapsed, exhausted, but the feeling that something had changed was palpable. The weight on me lifted, and the voices that were once screams turned into a distant whisper. I slowly got up, my body trembling, and realized that the morning light was starting to seep into the mausoleum. But deep down, I knew the battle was not over. It was only a temporary pause, and the question still lingered in the air. Where was Lara? What was that entity we were facing? I needed answers, and the truth was closer than I imagined. The connection between what I had seen and what had happened to Lara was becoming clearer, and I was determined to unearth the secrets buried in the past of Valle dos Rios. The morning light that entered the mausoleum was a balm for my tormented soul, but I would not be deceived. The feeling that everything was still far from resolved lingered in the air, like a fog that would not dissipate. As I tried to compose myself, a subtle sound caught my attention. A faint scratching, as if something was being moved in the depths of the mausoleum. Cautiously, I followed the sound, my heart racing with each step. The once oppressive environment now seemed on the verge of revealing a new secret. As I approached a broken tombstone in the corner, I noticed that the scratching intensified, and a small opening appeared beneath the stone. Without a second thought, I pushed the tombstone aside, and to my surprise, an empty space revealed itself. A passage leading down into the depths of the earth. Curiosity mingled with desperation compelled me to descend. The darkness was thick, and the dampness of the place enveloped my skin like a shroud. With each step, the feeling that something awaited me grew stronger. Finally, I arrived at an underground chamber. The walls were covered in strange worn symbols, and in the center stood a rudimentary altar surrounded by melted candles. It was then that the truth began to unfold before me. On the altar rested an ancient wooden box, adorned with the same symbols I had seen on the walls. In a sudden impulse, I opened the box and found a series of diaries, their pages yellowed and frayed. The pages were filled with notes about rituals, cults, and disappearances. Each word seemed to vibrate with an energy I could not ignore. But what made me stop was the last entry. My heart stopped as I read the name Lara. The words described an ancestral ritual, an invocation that promised power in exchange for souls. The cult had infiltrated the city decades ago, and the missing children were part of a dark sacrifice to ensure the continuity of their practices. With each cycle, more souls were needed, and the last entry indicated that Lara was the next target. Anger and sadness intertwined within me, and the feeling of helplessness transformed into determination. But deep down, something told me that this discovery was not a relief. The cult, which seemed to have been extinguished, was closer than I had imagined. And even more terrifying, I could be the next to disappear. What I thought was merely Lara's disappearance now revealed itself as a cog in a much larger and more malevolent machinery. I lifted my head and realized that the chamber had begun to vibrate. The walls pulsed, and the symbols started to glow with a sinister light. An oppressive presence began to form, and the voice of the child I had encountered earlier echoed again. "Help us. Don't let this happen." The tension mounted, and I realized that the cult was still active, not only in its practices, but also in its search for new members. They were just a few steps away from me, perhaps already watching. The darkness around me seemed to intensify, and the shadows took shape as if they wanted to trap me. It was then that the whispers turned into screams, and I saw the figures of the missing children manifest, their faces distorted by fear and pain. They were trapped, crying out for help, but also for revenge. What I had seen as a single disappearance unfolded into a web of pain and suffering, where the line between past and present blurred. With a desperate impulse, I grabbed the diaries and ran back to the exit. The ground began to tremble, and the chamber seemed intent on swallowing me whole. I felt that the entity, the cult, and the weight of all those lost souls were converging in an attempt to stop me. But I could not stop. Lara was out there, and I needed her. As I emerged from the mausoleum, the fresh morning air hit me like a punch, but there was no peace. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, and the atmosphere vibrated with palpable tension. What had once been a search for a lost love had now become a race against time. I needed to warn Roberto and Father Alvaro, but more importantly, I needed to figure out how to free the trapped souls and prevent Lara from becoming another victim. As I ran, the feeling that the cult could be watching my every move intensified. I was no longer just searching for answers. I was at the center of a conflict that transcended my understanding, and the shadows were closer than I would have liked to believe. The truth was nearer, but also more dangerous. The darkness had not dissipated. It was merely preparing for the next phase of its battle. Adrenaline pulsed through my veins as I ran through the forest surrounding the cemetery. The air, heavy and laden with moisture, seemed to try to hold me back, as if nature itself was in service of the cult that I now knew, was much more active than I had imagined. With each step, the memory of the missing children echoed in my mind, and the urgency to save Lara pushed me forward. For a moment, I thought about calling Roberto, alerting him to what I had discovered. But the idea of exposing all those terrifying truths to him, not knowing how he would react, made me hesitate. What if he didn't believe me? What if, instead of helping, he became a new victim? Doubt consumed me. Meanwhile, the image of Lara trapped in a cycle of pain compelled me to move on. I needed to find a solution, a way to unravel the cult and free the imprisoned souls. Suddenly, a new idea struck me. What if I could use the knowledge from the diaries to confront the cult? If they were operating in secret, perhaps there was a way to unmask them, to expose their practices so the city would know the truth. But with every step, uncertainty grew. What if the truth was even more dangerous than I imagined? I was about to plunge into a darkness that could swallow me whole. Upon arriving at Roberto's house, I noticed the windows were closed and the atmosphere was tense. I knocked hard on the door, my breath uneven. When he finally opened it, the expression on his face was one of concern. "What happened? You look pale." "Roberto, we need to talk. It's about Lara. She's in danger, and I discovered something terrible." The urgency in my voice seemed enough to convince him to listen. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, as if sealing off the outside world would protect me from any malevolent influence. As I recounted everything, from the mausoleum to the diaries, I noticed that Roberto was in internal conflict. His face twisted between disbelief and worry. "Do you really think a cult is behind the disappearances? That's insane. I know it sounds crazy, but the diaries, they talk about rituals, about a pattern of disappearances. Lara could be the next target." The intensity of my own voice frightened me. "We have to do something before it's too late." He hesitated, and that irritated me. "Roberto, you don't understand. It's not just about us, it's about all those children. They are trapped, and if we do nothing, not only Lara but other children will also become victims." Finally, he seemed to relent. "All right, what do you suggest? How can we stop this?" The idea of confronting the cult terrified me, but it also fascinated me. I remembered one of the rituals described in the diaries. If we can find out where they gather, maybe we can expose them. We can record everything and take it to the police. This could bring to light all the atrocities they have committed. Roberto nodded, but his eyes reflected a growing concern. What if they find out we're after them? And what if they try to silence us? The possibility of being silenced was real and imminent, and the thought of being hunted made me uneasy. But the vision of the lost children, their souls crying out for justice, gave me courage. We can't let fear stop us, we have to act. With a vague plan in mind, we began to search for information about the cult in the city. We spoke to people who had lived there for years, but most merely shook their heads as if the subject was taboo. However, an older woman who seemed to know something whispered about an old warehouse at the end of the street where strange rituals used to occur. But stay away, some things are better left forgotten. It was a warning I couldn't ignore. As I prepared for the invasion, a sense of doubt began to consume me. Was I really ready for what we might find? The idea of confronting the cult made me question my own motivations. I wanted to save Lara, but what if it cost me my life? What if I ended up becoming one of them, trapped in the same web of shadows they had created? As the sun set, darkness began to settle in, bringing with it a palpable fear. Deep down, I knew that every choice I had made had led me here, and now there was no turning back. The fight was about to begin, and the cult, with its hidden forces, was about to reveal itself before me. Thus, with a heavy heart and a conflicted mind, I headed toward the warehouse. The truth awaited me, but the price I would have to pay could be greater than I ever imagined. As I approached the site, the feeling that I was not alone intensified, and the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own, ready to devour anyone who dared to cross its path. The darkness enveloped the warehouse like a heavy cloak, and with every step I took toward the entrance, my heart raced faster. I was about to cross the line between the known and the unknown, and the reality that I might never return terrified me. The urgency to save Lara from a grim fate mixed with a deep fear of what I might find inside. As I approached the door, a series of conflicting thoughts began to flow through my mind. What if I was wrong? What if there was no cult at all, just the fertile imagination of a desperate mind? But the memories of the missing children echoed constantly, a reminder that something was very wrong. The idea that Lara could be next kept me steady, even as doubt tried to ensnare me. I pushed the door open, and the creak echoed like a scream in the silence. The interior of the warehouse was dark and dusty, with beams of light filtering through cracks in the walls. The smell of mold and rotting wood filled the air, and the sensation of being watched sent shivers down my spine. For every shadow that moved at the edge of my vision, I felt a chill run down my back. I was alone, but not alone. Something inside seemed to pulse, a malignant energy that made the air almost unbearable. I focused on the journals I had read. I remembered a ritual described, a type of invocation that might be in progress. I needed to find clues, something that would indicate they were truly there, that the cult was active. The tension rose with every step, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I was in a labyrinth of darkness, and the exit felt farther away. Suddenly, I heard whispers. The voices were low, almost indistinct, but the sensation that they were talking about me was undeniable. Adrenaline surged, and my breath became erratic. They knew I was there. A growing panic made me consider the possibility of retreating, but the image of Lara, trapped in the midst of macabre rituals, held me back. I couldn't give up now. I pressed on, navigating around broken objects and debris that seemed to have been left behind in some inexplicable haste. Every shadow morphed into a familiar figure. Every noise turned into a threat. The warehouse was a labyrinth of nightmares, and I was at its center, about to face what I feared most. Finally, I reached a larger room. The space was filled with lit candles, their flames flickering as if dancing to a music only they could hear. On an improvised altar, strange symbols were drawn with a dark liquid that looked like blood. My heart raced in my chest, and the realization that I was facing a real ritual hit me like a punch to the stomach. And then, anger and pain began to take over me. How could someone do this? How could they sacrifice innocent lives in the name of a dark cult? A wave of determination surged through me, and I knew I couldn't stand there watching this atrocity unfold. I had to act, but before I could formulate a plan, the door to the room burst open with a bang, and hooded figures entered. Their voices in unison echoing a sinister chant. Terror paralyzed me. They were about to perform the ritual, and I had only a moment to decide what to do. Doubt and fear transformed into internal chaos. If I revealed myself, I could be captured, but if I did nothing, Lara and other children would be doomed. Adrenaline took over, and in a desperate act, I decided I needed to expose them. I stepped out from behind a pile of boxes, my voice trembling but firm. "Stop! You can't do this! I'm here to stop you!" The hooded figures turned, and the chanting abruptly ceased. The tension was palpable, and the silence dragged on as if the very air was holding its breath. I stood before them, an intruder in a world I didn't fully understand, yet somehow also belonged to. The darkness emanating from them was oppressive, but something within me ignited. "You will pay for this," I shouted, with a courage I didn't know I possessed. One of them stepped forward, and the mask hiding his face didn't make him any less threatening. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his voice cold and deep. "You are meddling in affairs you cannot comprehend." And it was true. Fear mingled with the need to fight. What I knew about the cult was insufficient, and the possibility of being silenced grew with each passing second. But I couldn't back down. The life of Lara and so many other children depended on me. And so the battle began. The cult mobilized, and I found myself in the midst of a confrontation that could determine not only my fate, but that of all those trapped. In the web of shadows they had woven, the voices rose in a clamor, and I knew the truth was about to be revealed, but at what cost? As darkness surrounded me, the struggle for light intensified, and the line between good and evil grew ever thinner. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly unbearable. Their voices echoed in my mind like a distant echo of sinister laughter. The hooded figures advanced, forming a semicircle around me, and I realized I was surrounded. The flames of the candles danced, casting shadows that seemed to come alive, and the insinuation that I could be the next sacrifice hung in the air. "You don't know what you're doing," the man in front of me repeated, now closer. His presence was oppressive, as if darkness itself had taken shape in a human form. "This is not your fight. Step away, and maybe you'll come out unscathed." My hands trembled, but not from fear. It was the anger boiling within me, a flame that refused to be extinguished. "I won't let you hurt anyone else. Lara needs me, the children need me." With each word, my determination grew, and I knew I had to act before they consumed everything in a ritual that could seal the fate of innocent lives. One of the cultists, taller and more imposing, raised his hand, and I felt the pressure in the air intensify. It was as if the very space was being compressed by an invisible force. I could see a gleam in his eyes, an evil that fed off fear. "You have no idea what you're about to face. Our powers go far beyond what you can imagine." I looked at the altar, at the grotesque symbols and the candles illuminating the space with a macabre light. The image of Lara, pale and frightened, invaded my mind. The thought of losing her made me scream. "I am not afraid of you. What you're doing here is abominable, and I will put an end to it." With a swift motion, I charged toward the altar, determined to dismantle whatever that ritual was. The hooded figures recoiled, but not out of fear. It was a strategy to encircle. One of them lunged at me, and I dodged, feeling the air slice around me as he passed. The impulse guided me, and I managed to grab one of the candelabras. The flickering flame seemed to pulse in sync with my determination. "No, you can't do this," shouted the man who appeared to be the leader. His voice was a mix of frustration and rage, and I saw he was about to invoke something. Time seemed to slow down. My hands gripped the candelabrum tightly, and in a desperate act I lifted it and hurled it at the altar. The impact was explosive. The candles scattered like stars, disintegrating in space, and the dark liquid representing the blood of the innocents spread across the floor, as if being drained of its essence. A collective scream erupted from the mouths of the cultists. The leader, now in a fury, extended his hands and began to murmur words in a language I couldn't understand. The room vibrated, and I felt the presence of an evil force rising, a shadow that wanted to engulf me. I couldn't let that happen. I needed to act. I rushed toward the group, throwing punches and trying to take down the cultists one by one. The adrenaline surged in my blood, and every movement was guided by desperation and hope. The room became a battlefield, and I fought not only for my life, but for the life of Lara and the children who had vanished. But as the fight intensified, I realized that the force the leader was invoking was beginning to materialize. A shadow rose from the altar, an entity pulsating with a cold black energy. I stopped, paralyzed for a moment, as the true nature of what I faced revealed itself. It was a grotesque figure, with burning eyes and a presence that seemed to drain the very light from the room. "What have you done?" the leader shouted, his face twisted with rage. "Now you will pay." The entity began to move toward me, and I knew I had to find a way to defeat it. The image of Lara flashed through my mind again, and a wave of courage washed over me. If they were willing to sacrifice so many lives, I could not give in. "I am not afraid of you," I shouted, and in a frantic movement I hurled myself at the shadow, using the candelabrum as a weapon. The impact felt like hitting a wall, but the energy it emitted made the entity hesitate. The leader looked stunned, and I could see doubt in his eyes. "Now," I yelled, and seizing the confusion, I dashed toward the altar, where the symbols still pulsed with the energy they had invoked. I began to draw symbols on the ground with the dark liquid, words of protection I had read in the journals. The air around me began to vibrate. The shadow roared, a cry that echoed through the room and made the cultists recoil. The leader, now desperate, began to murmur again, but I could not allow him to complete the ritual. With one last effort, I finished the drawing, and a bright light erupted from the ground, illuminating the entire room. The entity's scream turned into an agonizing wail as the light enveloped it. The malignant force began to disintegrate, and the cultists, terrified, tried to escape, but it was too late. The light grew, consuming everything around it, and in an instant the room was filled with a blinding glow. When the light finally dissipated, the room was empty. The altar, the cultists, the shadow, everything had vanished. I was alone, gasping, my heart racing, but the feeling that I had saved Lara and freed so many other children began to settle within me. The truth about the disappearances had been revealed, and I knew I had faced absolute terror, but the cost of it all had been high. I needed to find Lara, and I knew the battle was not over. Whatever had been invoked could still be lurking, but for now, I had won. The light had triumphed over the darkness, and I was ready for the next fight. The light that had filled the room vanished, but the echo of the battle still reverberated in my mind. When reality re-established itself, I realized I was on the floor, gasping, with my hands dirty from the dark liquid that had once served for abominable rituals. The silence around me was deafening, an absence that felt like a scream. The altar, now empty, still exuded a sense of horror that seeped into my veins. I slowly got up, the pain coursing through my body like a cruel reminder of what I had faced. My skin was marked with scratches and bruises, but the deeper scars were in my mind. The fight had not only been physical, I had battled against something much more insidious and dark, something that would leave marks no bandage could cover. The voices of the cultists echoed in my mind, their malicious laughter still reverberating like a distant echo. Every step I took toward the exit seemed to pull me back into the darkness I had faced, as if the room were trying to drag me back. I knew I couldn't stay there. I needed to find Lara, but the thought of returning to that city, now steeped in horror, knotted my stomach. As I stepped outside, I realized the outside world hadn't changed. The trees still swayed gently in the wind, the moon continued to shine, but everything felt darker. What I had seen, what I had faced and overcome, was a reality that could not be ignored. The shadows seemed longer and the darkness denser. The city was shrouded in mystery, and the feeling that the battle was not yet over lingered with me. The children who had disappeared, including Lara, were now safe. I knew I had freed many lives, but the cost weighed on me like a curse. What I had discovered about the cultists and the ritual left me unsettled. For every life saved, there was a shadow that would forever remain by my side. I returned home, but the house was no longer the same. Every corner seemed to whisper the secrets I had unearthed, and the walls seemed to watch me with an accusatory gaze. The memory of the fight followed me like a shadow, and I knew I could never rid myself of it. The nights became long and lonely, and nightmares invaded my sleep, bringing back the image of the grotesque entity I had faced. The horror had not vanished, it had become part of me. During the day, I tried to act normally, but the people around me could sense the difference. A look in my eyes revealed what I had lived through. Friends and family asked questions I couldn't answer, and I found myself isolated in a sea of faces. The struggle against evil had changed me, shaped by experiences few could understand. The city continued its routine, but I knew there was something more. The cultists might have been defeated, but the evil they had summoned could still be lurking, hidden in the shadows. The urban legends about the city, the stories of disappearances, all felt more real now. I became an involuntary guardian, always alert for signs and whispers that might indicate the horror had returned. The emotional scars were the hardest to bear. Every time I saw a child, a chill ran through my body, reminding me of the lives at risk. I could not forget what had happened, nor could I allow others to forget. I began to document everything, every detail, every sensation. Words became my refuge, a way to exorcise the demons that haunted me. The truth was that I had solved a mystery, but the cost had been too high. What I had faced left me with a constant sense of vigilance, as if the life I knew was always on the brink of collapse. And as the shadows danced around me, I knew that what had happened was not an end, but perhaps only the beginning of a new struggle. I had survived, but the horror would never truly disappear. It would be part of who I am now, a constant reminder that even in the darkest hours, there was a spark of light. The battle might have ended, but the war against the darkness within and outside of me was just beginning. And with each passing day, I prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that no matter how deep the scars, hope could still shine, even in the darkest nights. As the sun began to set, tinting the sky with shades of red and orange, I sat in my room, surrounded by notes, sketches, and fragments of thoughts trying to make sense of the chaos that had settled in my life. Each word written was an attempt to organize the storm still raging within me, an effort to transform the pain into something understandable. But the more I wrote, the more I realized that some things simply could not be translated into words. The battle against the cultists and the entity they had summoned had been a fight for survival, but also a journey of discovery. I found that the line between light and darkness is thinner than I had imagined. Courage and weakness coexist in all of us, and the true struggle is not only against the evil outside, but also against the monsters that dwell in our own hearts. I had faced something terrifying, but the hardest part now was dealing with the reality that followed. What were those sinister laughs but echoes of insecurities that had always been within me? The ritual I had interrupted was not just an act of wickedness, but a manifestation of fears and desires that we all carry. The darkness they invoked was a reflection of the darkness I feared to confront within myself. I had become a battleground, and upon leaving that room, I had not only freed children, I had liberated a part of myself that had been trapped in the shadows. Lara was safe, but how many other children were living in a world where horror could lurk just beneath the surface? I could not help but think that somehow there was a cycle that needed to be broken. The city seemed indifferent, but I knew that the scars we leave on others can be as deep as the ones we carry. How could I live in a place where normalcy continued while I knew that evil could return at any moment? The whispers surrounding me now seemed more than mere echoes. They were warnings. Every lost glance in the crowd reminded me that the battle was not just mine, but of all of us. How could I explain to them what had truly happened? How could I share the pain without them feeling the weight of the horror I bore? This isolated me even more, as if I were trapped in an invisible bubble separating me from the rest of humanity. Pain and loss had become an intrinsic part of who I am. In the stillness of the nights, when nightmares returned, I wondered if I would ever find peace. The emotional scars I carried made me more perceptive, more vigilant. I began to see the world with new eyes, always searching for signs that something was wrong, like a tormented guardian who could not afford to relax. Yet at the same time, there was a spark of hope that refused to extinguish. Amidst the horror, I had found the strength to fight. I understood that even when darkness seems to prevail, there is always the possibility of light. This was something I needed to remember, not only for myself, but for those who still needed protection. The journey had not ended, it had merely transformed. And just like the scars on my body, the marks on my soul would remind me that I had faced the impossible. Each day, I commit to being more than a survivor. I want to be a beacon, a testament that the struggle is constant, but hope must never be abandoned. If darkness returns, I will be ready. And if I can make a difference in the life of a single child, then all the horror I faced will have been worth it. When I look to the future, I do not see it as a well-lit path, but as a trail filled with uncertainties and challenges. The questions that arise in my mind are many. What else will I be willing to face? How much more will I endure? But deep down, I know that the true answer lies in the choice to keep fighting, to not let fear define who I am. And so, with each step I take, I carry not only the weight of my scars, but also the responsibility to keep hope alive in a world that often seems dark. In the darkness, light may seem distant, but I know it exists. And as long as there is a breath of life, a spark of courage, I will be ready to fight, not only for myself, but for all those who, like me, have been touched by the shadow. The battle may never end, but the journey of hope and resilience is just the beginning. As the sky became a cloak of stars, I lost myself in thoughts reflecting on what had happened. What I had faced was not just a nightmare, but a cruel reality that had intertwined with my very being. Each night I relived those moments, every macabre laugh, every whisper of pain. The terror that once manifested in grotesque forms now hid in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Today, as I walked through the city streets, I noticed that life went on as if nothing had happened. People laughed, chatted, and lived their everyday lives, but I couldn't join them. The weight of my experiences isolated me, as if I were a spectator in a world where normalcy was the only valid reality. Yet, at the same time, something inside me refused to accept this indifference. I knew that evil had not disappeared, it simply waited for a new opportunity to infiltrate again. As I stepped away from the crowd, a strange sensation began to envelop me. It was as if the city was whispering secrets I couldn't fully comprehend. Fleeting glances and murmurs around me seemed to carry hidden meanings. There was something more there, something that didn't fit into the narrative of a tranquil, everyday life. My intuition, sharpened by past experiences, told me that darkness was still present, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That night, as I tried to find some peace in my room, the moonlight filtered through the curtains, creating dancing shapes on the walls. Suddenly, an idea began to take shape in my mind. What if those cultists weren't really gone? What if what I had done, in interrupting the ritual, had merely sealed something much deeper? It wasn't just my mind that was at war. It was something much larger, something that moved in the shadows like a predator lurking. I got up, determined to uncover the truth. The city was filled with places that, at first glance, seemed ordinary, but could hide secrets I needed to unravel. I went to every corner, talking to those willing to listen, searching for signs that could guide me. But with each new lead that seemed promising, more questions emerged. More mysteries intertwined like an endless labyrinth. In that search, I found an old diary in a second-hand bookstore. The yellowed pages contained references to dark rituals, to cults that originated long before I imagined. Would what I had faced be just the tip of the iceberg? What else lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered? Fear mingled with excitement, and I realized there was something profoundly disturbing about my desire for answers. Was I a guardian of the light, or just another drawn to darkness? As I read, a sense of urgency consumed me. The diary spoke of a new ritual, one that could be performed soon. A ritual that promised to bring back everything that had been lost. What else could this mean? The idea that evil could be reborn put me on high alert. Yet at the same time, there was a fascination that drew me to this revelation. I was about to cross a line that could not be undone. And in the moment, I decided I needed to act. The lights of the city began to flicker. A chill ran down my spine, reminding me of the battle I had fought. Darkness was approaching again, and I didn't know if I had the strength to face it. What I had awakened could be much worse than I imagined. In a moment of clarity, I realized that the struggle was far from over. On the contrary, it was just beginning. What had I done? What had I unleashed? The questions echoed in my mind as the night grew denser. What lay ahead could be terrifying, but a part of me knew I could not retreat. I had promised to be a beacon, and now, more than ever, I needed to find that light within me. And so, as darkness approached, I prepared to confront the unknown. Shadows danced around me, but it wasn't the end I feared. It was the realization that perhaps, just perhaps, the true battle was not in defeating evil, but in understanding that the line between light and darkness is thinner than I thought. And as the night became increasingly oppressive, I realized that the answers I sought might be much closer than I imagined. If you have ever felt the weight of a secret, if you have ever confronted the darkness that resides within each of us, share your experiences. Let's explore together this mystery of life, this dance between light and shadow. Like and subscribe so we can continue this journey, so we can face the monsters that inhabit both the outside world and the inner one. The struggle never ends, but hope and the search for answers will unite us. What more are you willing to face?